Greetings, everyone. My name is Dr. Thomas Foldis. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at the OII. And to everyone online and in the room, welcome to Nutrition, Not Calories, findings from the largest open source dataset of video game behavior and health. We're delighted to have my friend and colleague, Dr. Nick Ballou, with us today to discuss how games are used to compensate for a bad day, how late night play relates to sleep, and how play habits change as we age. Nick Ballou is a postdoctoral researcher here at the OII. He's a psychologist, a lifelong video game player, researching how gaming affects mental health. This includes both positive impacts, such as stress relief and social support, and negative impacts, such as frustration and gaming at the expense of other responsibilities we have, such as work and school. I just checked on OpenAlex after Nick's stats, and it said you had 85% of your academic output being open access, and then we talked about it, and you said it's actually much better than that, because if we only count first author papers, it's closer to 100%, and I think that's very impressive. Also the number and the rate of open access, given that you just finished your PhD in 2023. And I saw an interview where you were saying, I think it was in 2020, and they were asked where you see yourself in 5 years, which is approximately now. And you wanted to be in academia, and the evidence is that that worked out. So I'm very happy about that. Before I move on, for your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. The presentation will run about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by a discussion at the end. If you're joining us online, please put your questions into the Q&A box, and those in the room, save your questions until the end, and Nick will answer them after the talk. If you wish to ask any questions with your mic or camera on, please raise your hand during the Q&A and we will call on you. Be aware this will be included in the recording. It's great to have you here, Nick, and I will now hand over to you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So, yeah, thanks for spending your lunch with me. I'm going to talk to you about a project that we've been doing for about 2 years and that has taken no fewer than 5 off of my lifespan. And yeah, hopefully I can keep it a little informal. I'll ask for participation at a couple points if you're up for it. High level, I submit to you as a premise that the effect of video game play on mental health is determined by the quality, not the quantity of play. And I can say that fairly confidently because we've done it a bunch of times. When I say we, I mean both the lab that I'm now part of, working with Andy Shabilsky here at the OII, and some of the work that I've done on my own. So 4 years ago, they did a paper looking at 2 games in particular. Animal Crossing, big popular kind of cozy game, took off massively during the pandemic, and another game, Plants vs. Zombies. And they find a very slight but kind of practically insignificant relationship between playtime in the last 2 weeks and well-being. They then expanded that to a list of 7 games and multiple time points. So instead of looking at just 1 time point, they looked at 3 time points over the course of 6 weeks with a huge set of about 40,000 players, and found that changes in a person's time spent playing video games didn't relate to changes in their well-being. We then moved on to capturing games across an entire platform. So we went from 7 games to something like 250 that are available or that were included in our data set on the Nintendo Switch about a year ago. Finding, and we were trying to link playtime over the previous hour, over the previous 2 hours, previous week, previous month. We were seeing whether play over any time period predicted how people were feeling at that moment, and it does not. But as an aside, people's evaluations of play do. If you ask people, to what extent do you think games contribute to your life in the area of social health, in the area of cognitive health, in the area of routines and habits? The people who endorse those statements, who say, I do think games are contributing to my sense of well-being, are also feeling better in general. They also report higher social well-being and other types of well-being. We did the same thing on another platform. So instead of Nintendo Switch, we now looked at Xbox players. The previous paper was quite casual. Players were only playing an hour or 2 a week, sometimes even less. In this paper, people were playing 2 hours a day and up on average. So we had a really highly engaged group of Xbox players, about 100,000 hours over a 3-month period. And we got a closer look at the extremes. So people who were playing even 4 hours a day or more were reporting feeling no worse or no better than their peers who were playing an hour a day or less. So even at the extremes, playtime doesn't tell us a lot. about well-being. And in one final paper, we looked really in depth in one particular game. So instead of trying to capture all the games people were playing, we tried to really look granularly at a particular game they were playing, in this case, Power Wash Simulator. You literally clean things with a pressure hose in a virtual world. It is incredibly satisfying. Highly recommend if you need a Zen de-stressor at the end of the day. And we similarly found that well-being and playtime were not related in any long-term sense, although we did find in this case a mood boost at the beginning of a session. So we do find that when people start playing the game, their mood goes up by about 7 points on a 100-point scale. That sounds minor, but it's actually quite big in this scheme of mood because most people are sort of between a 60 and an 80 at any given time. Like mood fluctuates less on a 1 to 100 scale than we think it does. And that increase happens mostly in the first 15 minutes. So that might tell us something about why we don't see longer relationships between playtime and well-being, because people experience a short-term boost in the first 15 minutes and they kind of plateau, but it might not contribute to any longer sense of fulfillment or satisfaction. So if it's not time, how do video games affect mental health? And I will briefly ask for a contribution or two. Can anyone think of a way that games might affect someone's mental health for better or for worse? Some effect that someone might experience. Sorry, go ahead. Sure, yeah, losing might induce some sense of frustration. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
If you were constantly feeling frustrated playing it, maybe like the longer you get, the more frustrated you become.
Certainly, yeah. My PI, Andy, did a whole study on that. He did an experiment where they changed the controls to be very unintuitive. They made the controls very difficult to use, and then showed that one, people got very frustrated when playing with those controls, and that they were more aggressive afterwards. So we hear a lot about violent video games causing people to feel aggressive. In this case, we looked at frustrated players feeling aggressive afterwards, and they showed that pretty strongly. In fact, it was a much better predictor of aggression than violence is. So that's absolutely a possible effect. Any other ones? Yeah.
The type of interactions that people are having with other players on the game platform, whether those are having like positive interactions or it's pretty toxic.
Yeah, absolutely. Huge one. Really, really important. And in fact, the first one that I was going to mention on the list that we made, sorry, Ellen, for the the unprepared solicitation of audience participation. We wrote a paper looking at 13 ways that in the scientific literature, people are talking about games and well-being. And these are sort of haphazard, like we don't, as a community, have a really good sense of what effects we're actually expecting and how we expect to get there. But we do kind of coalesce in certain areas, and we tried to put some formal language and causal modeling behind those areas. And the first one that we looked at was, in fact, social well-being. This is a huge one. If you talk to players, this will almost invariably be the first thing that they tell you. They will tell you, I enjoy playing games because I find it a really good way to connect with my friends, connect with people that are living on the other side of the country to me that I don't get to see very often, to connect with family. I have more fun playing games with my friends than I have doing other activities with my friends. This was a big one during the pandemic. Instead of being on a Zoom and staring at each other and like, how's lockdown where you are? Pretty bad. That's not a very fulfilling social interaction. When people turn to games, they reported having much more positive social experiences. So we hear a lot about social well-being in the context of games. I will highlight a few more. I won't go through all 13, but a huge one that people talk about in the scientific literature is displacement. Time is finite. If you're playing a game, you're not doing something else. And the thing that you're not doing might be more or less important to your sense of fulfillment or well-being overall. If you're playing a game instead of watching Netflix, probably a much more a trade-off that is much easier to make and less likely to be harmful than if you're playing games instead of doing the assignment that you know is due tomorrow, or instead of seeing a friend who's only in town for a day, or any number of other possible substitutions. Stress relief, big one. We hear lots from people that if they're having a bad day or a longer period of low moods, extending all the way up into feelings of grief, feelings of job loss, people turn to games for escapism or to relieve those stressful feelings. A big one that is finally starting to get more attention that I really think is valuable and worth exploring more is identity development. Games are very good at allowing people to put on different hats to allow them to experience what life is like as a different character. People are gender bending, people are role playing, people are experiencing a story from the perspective of a character in a very different time and place from them. And all of that can, at least qualitatively, contribute to how people understand their own sense of identity. That can be really positive, especially for marginalized people. Toxicity being a huge one. If you play games in a multiplayer setting, you will inevitably encounter people who are somewhere on the spectrum from rude to outright cruel and targeting. And that, of course, can linger with people. I, for example, don't really play multiplayer games anymore because I find that I'm not able to let go of toxic experiences. Like, they stick with me for hours afterwards. And even if I have a good play session, that, that 2-minute interaction might affect the rest of my day in a way that I don't particularly enjoy. And the last one I'll highlight is nostalgia. Video game consoles became popular in the 80s to have in homes. So there is now a generation of people who grew up with consoles in the home that are now parents, approaching grandparenthood, approaching retirements, and those people are returning to the games that they played in their pasts as a way to feel some sense of connection to their childhoods. So we're seeing a big increase in retro gaming, or classic gaming as they call it, and that this is used for intergenerational bonding. That's parents are playing with their kids or grandparents are playing with their grandkids as a way to say, this is what life was like for me back then a little bit. This is the game. These are the games that we used to play. And a lot of those games are really well designed and continue to be incredibly engaging to this day. Bunch more of these that I won't talk about. But the point is, we do have a lot of ideas about what kind of effects games might be having on people besides time. What determines whether those effects happen? So every single one of these effects here is something that happens sometimes for some people. And we know that most directly from qualitative evidence, from people talking about this is a thing that happened to me, some of them with initial quantitative evidence as well, with greater or lesser rigor, depending on which kind of area you're looking at. But we don't yet have a good way to say this effect will happen to this person. Our predictive ability to say in advance the conditions under which an effect will happen remains simply really, really poor. So we're doing forensics as media researchers at the moment. Often we're saying this person experienced a bad outcome, this maybe is why, and we're not proactively getting involved to say, here are the things that you need to change in order to prevent this bad outcome from occurring or to create this positive outcome instead. What determines whether those effects happens is really complicated, and that's part of the problem. So it might be the fact that someone played it all, playing a game versus not playing a game, sort of a displacement consideration. It might be the particular features or the affordances of the game that they played, looking carefully at design characteristics and social settings and how it feels to level up in this game, which can be really subtle in some cases. It might be how the person felt when they were playing it, the player experience, sort of this emergent sense of how people make sense of their time playing a game, whether they subjectively value it, whether they find it meaningful, whether they were curious when they were playing it. Those types of emotional experiences might be what determines whether games are helping or harming someone. The content, whether it includes sexualized characters or violence. The monetization, a huge one these days, a lot of predatory monetization happening with games kind of taking advantage of vulnerable players. It might be the platform. We might expect different effects of VR games than of Xbox games. The social context, the physical context, if they're sitting or standing, if they're on the tube, if they're at home, what they would have done instead, time of day, all of these things fit together and co-determine the effects of that particular game playing session and indeed of game playing as a whole on people's lives. And I am saddened that we haven't made more progress as a field, but I also understand that this is really difficult nut to crack for us to kind of piece together which of those factors is relevant and how they maybe work together is a really challenging problem. So we tried to put some clarity around this topic. We made a model that you don't need to look at in detail, but the high level is that we differentiated 3 different types of factors that might influence the effect of a game. The context, the game itself, and the player who is approaching that game. So just to highlight a couple examples, we can talk about the time context. The amount of play is one part of that, certainly. The difference between an hour and 4 hours can matter in some cases, but maybe more important might be, again, the displacement, what they would have done instead, the substitution of that time, or it might be the time of day. There was a paper that looked at early morning play on weekdays as a really strong predictor of worsened academic performance in kids. Makes sense. If you're playing games at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday as a 15-year-old, probably not great for your school performance. We can look at the game. I just highlighted monetization, but maybe something about the business model is the thing that determines whether this game is benefiting or harming someone. Loot boxes are really get a lot of scrutiny these days. Loot boxes are items in a game that you buy with real world money, but whose contents are uncertain. So you might get something that's very valuable, but more often than not, you will get something that is not very valuable. And there's been a lot of criticism of these resembling gambling in many ways, and that they might be linked with higher rates of problem gambling in the future, and that they therefore might be harmful, especially to kids for whom they are very accessible. You can find, especially on mobile games rated for kids 6 and up, 10 and up, 12 and up that have these gambling adjacent features in them. So they are really prominent and might be one of the impactful things about games. On the player side of things, we might look at the purpose of play. It might not matter so much what they're playing, but matter more about what they wanted to get out of the game when they went in there. You will talk to players, and sometimes there is no clear thing I want to get out of it. Can be very habit-driven, sort of automatic play. And sometimes it can be very intentional. They can say, I'm playing this game because I want to feel a sense of connection to this character. There's a story that they want to progress and a world that they want to inhabit, and they want to play because of that. Or it might be, again, because of social factors. And those reasons for picking up a game and playing it might be indeed the things that determine whether it's impactful for them. So yeah, why we have this model, we know something about the types of factors that might determine the effects of games, but we still are not yet to the point where we can say which of these factors will reliably lead to certain outcomes, and that is because of 2 factors, namely a lack of causal theories and models. So we're doing a lot of really haphazard correlation as a field and very little causal modeling and thinking carefully through the data generating process and dealing with things like confounds. That simply is just not happening at scale. And we're stuck with pretty low quality data in the sense of mostly self-reported play. Mostly researchers are asking people, tell me about what games you played in the last 2 weeks or the last 3 months or the last year. And we know quite conclusively at this point that people are bad at estimating those things. It's really difficult to remember what you did yesterday, much less 3 months ago in terms of gameplay, and limited to very high level things. Like you can maybe ask someone to estimate the total amount of play in the last 2 weeks, and they'll give you something halfway meaningful, but you'll have a much harder time asking them to talk about who they were with, who they were playing with at any given time, about the time of day when that play happens, about whether they were successful, were they winning or losing over the course of that session, whether they had a social interaction that was toxic with somebody. Those qualitative factors about their play are much more difficult for someone to report on themselves. And ideally, we would capture them in an automated way. And that is most of what we spend our time doing in our group, is trying to capture better what we call digital trace data, sometimes telemetry data, sometimes objective behavioral data, but records from the games and the software itself of how people are interacting and behaving in those games. Which brings us to the study that we've been running that attempts to deal with this, move a little bit forward on these 2 lacking fronts of low quality theory and low quality data. We're calling it the Open Play Study, but I'm open to to new name suggestions, kind of a placeholder name. The way it worked is we recruited a bunch of people and we got them to link their digital trace data. So link automatic records of play across these 5 platforms. So you had seen on my early slides, we started with a game, then we had a couple games, and we had a platform. Now we're trying to capture all the games that people are playing across 5 different platforms, no matter how many of those they use. So if we find a player that plays on Nintendo and Steam and Android, we're trying to capture their gameplay from all 3 of those things, because it might be really informative to know when they're moving from one platform to another, when they're playing a particular game on Nintendo Switch and then moving to a different type of game on Steam. Those types of comprehensive records of people's use are really, really valuable if we're trying to understand the nuances of how games are affecting their lives. How we got those data varied. For Nintendo and Xbox, we negotiated data sharing agreements with Nintendo and with Microsoft, which was a fraught and long process that I will return to in a little bit. For Steam, we developed a custom web application, and when I say we, I mean mostly my colleague Christopher in Sweden developed a web app where people could sign into their Steam account and authorize us to track their play on an hourly basis. And for iOS and Android, we are using screenshots. So there's, at least on many phones, an interface where you can look at your usage over the past day or the past couple of weeks and take a screenshot and upload that for us, which we then extract using OCR to get a roughly comprehensive picture of play across these 5 platforms. Once people have linked their gaming accounts, we have them do a number of psychological assessments and measures. So we have daily surveys, which we ran for 30 days. Part of the daily survey is a time use diary that I really want to shout out because my colleague Tomasz here at the front of the room made this and low-key revolutionized how time use diaries are completed. Like, truly, it surprised us both to learn that most time use diaries are completed like really crudely, still often with pen and paper. And so having a user-friendly way to do this, why can't I get this? Here it is. Having a user-friendly, clean way to do this in a web app was a game changer. And so we implemented it here. It looks like this. So every day for 30 days. This is the mobile setup, right? Do I just need to go wide?
Yeah, you need to go widescreen. Yeah. If you go full screen, I think it will switch to the desktop layer, but I think it might be full screen.
Really struggling to, there we go. So we had people tell us a little bit about their previous 24 hours. They might tell us that they were sleeping until 8, and then that they were doing home maintenance of some particular kind. In Tamash's case, a lot of house construction, renovation.
Yeah. And
through this, we then get a record of, for 30 days, how they were spending their time beyond just games.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, online people. The link will be there if you want to check out the web app. It's great. I encourage you to do so.
Yes, and pull requests are welcome for further.
Yeah, and contributors sought. So they did those 2 things for 30 days. In addition, they also did bi-weekly surveys for 3 months, so 6 bi-weekly surveys over a 12-week period. And in part of those bi-weekly surveys, they also completed a cognitive task that I will briefly show off. Okay. But that one just looks like this. This one's called the Simon task, and it is sort of similar to the Stroop task, the words and colors task, if you're familiar with that one. It tests your ability to quickly identify which way the arrow is pointing, regardless of what side it is on. And the faster you do this and the more accurate you are, the better your attentional control. So we also have a measure of cognitive health, or executive function at least, as part of this sort of survey battery. And we were interested in not looking just at time, because I am super bored of Playtime and well-being at this point, 5 studies later. So we looked at 3 more qualitative aspects pulled from that list of effects that I referenced before. The first one being, we were interested in late night play after 11 p.m. we thought might reduce sleep quantity and sleep quality, especially for people who have a earlier chronotype. So people have a natural tendency to be wakeful at different times of day, sort of circadian rhythm adjacents. And the people who are naturally inclined to be awake during the day and sleep earlier at night might be more affected by late night play than those who are more inclined to be awake at night. So we looked at that. We expected that people would compensate for certain need frustrating days by playing games. This is similar to stress relief, but through the lens of what they call basic psychological needs theory, the idea that people have innate and universal needs to feel a sense of autonomy, to feel in control of their actions, to feel competent, to feel a sense of mastery and effectiveness over their activities, and to feel relatedness, connection to others, feeling cared for and caring. There's lots of evidence to back those up as universal needs, and some evidence to suggest that people, when they're not getting those needs from real life, might go and get them from games instead. So we expected that. And we similarly expected that people who were having really need-satisfying experiences in those games, when they are getting those exact same 3 needs from games, that might update their expectations, and then they would play more games in the future. So we expect some sort of really crude Bayesian updating of, if I'm getting really satisfying gaming experiences, I will continue to play more and more games afterwards. And then we wanted to look at genres. So this as a logical extension of whether games, whether playtime at large is related to well-being. Maybe we would see certain genres, maybe first-person shooters are different than platformers, are different than cozy simulation games or things like that. So that was our next fairly, one small step forward on the time factor to see if different kinds of time might be more informative than others. Worth highlighting that this project is published as, or will be published as, a so-called programmatic registered report. And I want to highlight this for open science reasons because it's very cool. In a conventional study, you would plan your study, conduct your study, submit your article, respond to peer review, and eventually your report will be published. In a registered report, they introduce peer review at 2 stages. So you plan your study, you submit your study plan, and that is peer reviewed. So instead of peer reviewers taking a completed study and poking holes and saying, here's why it's bad, peer reviewers become much more collaborative, and they say, oh, here's something you didn't think about when you were designing your study and a better way that you might run it. You address those comments. Once you have agreed together with the reviewers that you have a sensible research design, you go and run your study. You do the analyses that you said you were going to do. The reviewers look at it one more time mostly to check, did you run the study as you said you were going to run it, and analyze the data in the way you said you're going to analyze, as opposed to kind of fishing for spicy or flashy results that may not be true. And if you've done that, then your report gets published automatically. So it's a fairly big revolution in how publishing is happening over the last 7-ish years, that if you are ever getting involved in publishing and have hypotheses, I highly recommend you to check out. The innovation of a programmatic registered report is the idea that you have one study plan and multiple outputs. So the study plan was what I showed you, the way that we're collecting gameplay data and surveying people. And those 3 hypotheses are each different outputs because they're each quite chunky things. It doesn't really make sense for us to publish one paper that talks about sleep and needs and genres all together. That would be very difficult to digest. So instead, we have 3 pre-planned, pre-specified analyses based on this data that will result in 3 different papers. This is animated poorly, clearly, but this is what the recruitment process looked like. And mostly the bottom row is what we're looking at anyway. So we screened almost 35,000 people. Of those, 4,000 linked at least one gameplay account from those 5 platforms. Most of those people had at least some digital trace data, some behavioral data from that platform, but only about half of them had data that was recent enough for us to, for them to qualify for the study. We only wanted people who were playing now. If you played 6 months ago, that's not really very informative for our research. And then of those, about 1,900 began the surveys, started taking those daily and biweekly surveys that I was talking about. So we went from 35,000 to 1,800 at the end. A very challenging process, and we initially thought that some of the big panel providers, you hear companies like YouGov or Ipsos, who are in theory, specialized in doing this kind of work would help us. And in fact, they did the opposite, and they kind of hindered us and set us back about 6 months, and we had to do it all ourselves. So there was a lot of learning that went into that, but we did get there in the end. Oh, that's why it was poorly animated. It was animated in the wrong direction. Sorry. So what that produced at the end of this process, we have about 16,000 daily well-being surveys asking about everything from stress to how you feel at this moment, your life satisfaction. We have about 7,000 bi-weekly surveys, which are asking about larger topics related to gaming disorder or addiction. We're asking about sleep quality and daytime sleepiness. We're asking about depression. We have their Xbox sessions from the past 3 years, comprising about 500,000 hours. We have the Nintendo sessions from the past 3 years, comprising about 100,000 hours. Nintendo players typically play less Nintendo than Xbox players play Xbox. Nintendo is a more casually oriented platform. We have Steam hourly play, starting when people opted in. So for Nintendo and Xbox, we can go back into the past because the companies are helping us. For Steam, we can only look forward into the future. We got about 3,000 hours, 300,000 hours there. And we have a much smaller proportion of mobile data because, one, people don't game that much on mobile in the West, at least, or at least our participants did not. And it's pretty difficult to get people to reliably submit good screenshots and for us to extract that data. So we have a little bit more sparse mobile data and another about 3,000 measures of that cognitive health test that I showed you. So moving into findings, at a descriptive level, this is sort of a visualization of what the data looks like. And part of what I'm doing right now is pitching you or any of your colleagues or anyone you know who might be interested in using this data, because there are a lot of opportunities for studies that we don't have planned and don't have capacity to run that I think an interested researcher could happily take on, and that we would be able to help, help make the data usable and ensure that you're comfortable with what's in there. But we can look at people with different play patterns. So in the 25th percentile, people are playing, a session or two a week here and there. They might have a long gap. They went about 2 weeks between waves 5 and 6 without playing. In the middle, we see sort of a mix of platforms. So we are seeing that people are transitioning. This person in the bottom was playing a lot of mobile games at the beginning of the study and then transitioned to mostly Xbox and Nintendo play as the study went on. We looked at the difference between what people told us they were playing in terms of time and what we recorded from them in terms of time. And we do see some pretty notable differences. Steam people were telling us they were playing crazy hours. They were telling us they were playing, 15 hours a week or so. We actually recorded more like 8 or 9 hours a week from them. Xbox people were telling us the opposite. So they were reporting something like 10 hours a week, and we were getting more like 15. Some of this can be difficult to assess based on something like idle time. If you leave a game open on your Xbox and then you go away, we will, until your Xbox turns off and that session ends, we have to count that because we have no way to say that you weren't there playing. But it might be that people on Xbox compared to other platforms are more likely to just leave their console on and they turn it on at 10 a.m. and then they go have lunch and they come back, and not all of that is play that they're considering when they self-report to us, but it is captured in the behavioral data. So it's not necessarily the case that one of these is ground truth per se. They're sort of two different ways of accessing the information that we're interested in. On mobile, we got a little bit more correspondence there. So that was sort of the descriptive level, and then briefly talking about what we've learned so far about those hypotheses we mentioned, which are preliminary. I will caution, none of this is published yet. So we've just finished, we're about to publish the paper that, or preprint the paper that explains the data. So that QR code at the beginning that I'll show at the end is the link to the paper that describes this data. And then with that clean data, we are now in the process of conducting these analyses. But high level, we seem to see that late night play is not meaningfully displacing sleep. So we classified sessions as described into daytime and late night if they're happening after 11 p.m. another way of looking at the exact same plot that I just like because it's pretty, showing that play peaks at about 9 or 10 p.m., especially on weekdays, weekends rather. Those are the times that people are most likely to be caught playing games actively. And we see if we do a kind of crude categorization of players into a daytime or late night type based on how much of their play is happening in the daytime and how much of their play is happening at night. We do see that the people who are playing games later at night have a little bit higher daytime sleepiness in terms of a mean. So that blue line, people who are playing games at night 50% of the time are a little bit sleepier during the daytime than people who are never playing games late at nights. But these distributions are all heavily overlapping. That is not a significant difference, and probably not a practically significant difference. So if it's happening, it seems to be minor, that even people who are playing late night games really frequently are mostly functional during the daytime, more so than we maybe initially expected. On the need topic that I mentioned, really basic, that kind of replication of previous results, we know that people who are feeling satisfied in the games that they play are also feeling satisfied in daily life. Can be for any number of reasons. Maybe being satisfied in games contributes to your sense of feeling satisfied in daily life. Maybe people who are satisfied in their life as a whole are sort of better able to appreciate and access the experiences in games. They're more open to enjoying those, more ready to enjoy those gaming experiences. And we do find that a small potential effect of, or at least relationship between need satisfying play sessions and subsequent probability of play. So on an average day, people are sort of 40% likely to play in the day after completing the survey. They do their daily survey and we check, did you play in the next 24 hours? 40% of the time that's true. But if they have had a highly need satisfying session during that, when they had completed the survey, that goes up by about 10% up to. So we see some minor relationship between people who are really enjoying the games that they're playing and their likelihood of playing games again in the near future. However, we do not find what we expected in terms of compensation. So people who are feeling more need frustrated as a whole, who are feeling constrained at work and ineffective and lonely or disconnected from their peers, we thought those people would be more likely to play games in the time after completing their survey. And in fact, it's non-significant, but maybe even trending in the opposite direction. The people who are feeling poorly are less likely to play games than more likely. So if people are compensating or engaging in the stress relief process, it's not happening systematically in the way that we expected. And I wish that I had genre results to show you, but I'm afraid I do not yet. That's a difficult process of coding the games for genres. We have to sort of link metadata about the games to the digital trace data that we have, and we haven't finished that yet, so I can't show you the genre information yet. I do want to highlight some opportunities that I think are in the data. So we collected information about neurodiversity. We have something like 400 participants who self-identify as having autism. We have another 350 who self-identify as having ADHD, some of whom also report a clinical diagnosis. So it might be interesting to look at play differences between neurodiverse and neurotypical players. We have some information about representativeness. We have educational attainments. We have ethnic background. So maybe we can observe some differences in how different groups of players are playing. We can look at natural experiments. So this data, because these are US and UK participants, and stretch back to 2022, a lot of impactful world events have happened in that time period. And we might, for example, in November of last year, see some differences in how Americans are playing games. Maybe even differences between Democrats and Republicans are playing games, because we have that information as well. We also have political affiliation. We can look at social experiences. We ask people a bunch of questions about who they were playing with in their most recent sessions. Were they on the couch with somebody? Were they playing online? We have information about Big Five personality and player types and how those people are playing. All to say, if you have not just students, any researcher who might want to work with this data, please do get in contact, and we'd be happy to help set you up to work with it, because I think there are a number of opportunities that we won't, on our team, have the opportunity to, the capacity to undertake. Wrapping up, I think what high level what this project is trying to do, and hopefully takes one tiny step forward, is to move away from what is really the status quo to this day of how research on games is done. This is true to a large extent of social media, but I think social media as a field is moving a little bit faster than research on games is, for reasons that I don't fully understand. They're a little bit more computationally and methodologically sophisticated than games research is at the moment. So games research is really still spending a lot of time looking at one effect, often of playtime raw and one time point. They're looking at really broad self-reported aggregates of behavior, and the data access is really selective. To the extent that there is any behavioral data available, it is limited in who it can reach. And what we're hoping to do is look at this in the context of many effects, indeed coexisting effects. It's absolutely the case that sometimes playing a game might be good for you in the moment. You might have had a really bad day, and the escapism of the game in that hour or 2 hours is really positive, but it also displays something that is beneficial for you in the long term. You didn't cook, or you didn't spend time with your partner, and that may have sort of a smaller, more incremental harm. And for us to understand those things, we have to untangle maybe different effects happening at the same time at different time scales. To do that, we need data that reflects that nuance, that is deep, that is longitudinal, that is moment to moment, and that is available to as many people as possible using the types of open source tools that we're trying to make, and the industry access that we are trying to broker for more than just our own lab, in part by making this data available, and in part by advocating for sort of more institutionalized systems of data exchange between industry and academia. Very briefly, some of the good things about working with industry that we learned from this project. For some data, this is the only way that we could have gotten it. At the time of study, there is no access to Nintendo data had we not worked with them. The fact that we worked with them gave us data going back 3 years that we otherwise would have struggled to get. And I think we're, like I said, trying to act as a normalizing force. We're trying to make this kind of data sharing, collaboration, something that is commonplace and that is not perceived as threatening, and that we all can sort of agree that we have a common goal of player health and player safety, and make these kinds of agreements more widespread. But it has not been an easy process. It is extremely slow. Something like 18 months in between starting the data sharing agreement negotiation and getting a signature. The data is limited. Like you saw with the Xbox data, we don't get the titles themselves. They have their own politics about what they can and can't share. There are constraints on what we can study. So, for example, having data on minors, on under 18s, was immediately off the table, like complete non-starter. The companies would never share data on that, at least at this stage of the landscape of academic industry collaboration. And that's a much more interesting group. Like, I am more worried about the effects of games on 12-year-olds and 16-year-olds than I am on 25-year-olds and 35-year-olds. But that's the reality of what we can study right now. Hopefully, we'll be changing that in the future. There's a risk of this performative element, that companies can get the PR credit for working with us. They get a fancy Oxford branded press release that they can show off without it being a meaningful test of what their systems are doing to people. So we have to be really careful to make sure that the studies that, as we design them, have the possibility to show harm. And that we can be honest about, what that looks like, and the fact that it's nuanced. We're not going to turn over a rock and find that games are ruining a generation, because they're not, but we might find that certain groups of people are being harmed, and we need to have the ability to find and communicate that honestly. So using things like the registered report that I talked about, that sort of tie us to the mast and say, here's a meaningful way to analyze the data, help us to do that. And it cannot emphasize enough how slow it was. Even when the data sharing agreement is signed, we would submit a request and say, okay, we have our players, please send us the data from those players. Sometimes that would take 20 emails in a month and a half to ever get the data. We need this ideally quickly so that we can get a participant, confirm that they're eligible, invite them to the surveys. And we lost a lot of participants in this process because it took so long to even confirm with the company that this player exists and is valid. Truly an arduous process. So in the near future, we are working on real-time tracking. We're going to start sending context-aware surveys. We have systems that can detect when a game is started and closed and poll people for their experiences much closer to the game session than we were previously able to get. We'll start doing more experimental studies, telling some groups of players to play in particular ways, maybe change something about the social environment of their play or the time of day of their play. Maybe they can abstain from gaming for a little while and see how that affects them. And we're really interested in looking much more at this time course thing that I mentioned, the idea that effects might be slow and accumulative, or they might be spiky and then disappear immediately. Like in that power wash data, you might have an effective play just for 15 minutes. And if we don't catch you in that 15 minutes, the effect disappears. So having experience sampling methods and related tools for finding those types of both short and nuanced and long-term and accumulative effects is very much our goal. Shout out to the team, and especially to Tomasz, without whom the study absolutely would not have happened. And I am happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Thank you. I'm happy to start. Hi, Nick. I don't, does this microphone actually amplify? Okay. Okay, get it. Yeah, so I wanted to ask, what are the exact limitations of working with industry in what you can and cannot do in your research? So for example, obviously you can't compare those different games. It's obvious that they don't want you to do that. Can you compare the different platforms because you're working with several? So what's to stop you from doing that? Because that might be something which only independent scientists are actually able to do or likely to do without any bias.
So the data is open, and on that level, like anything is fair game. If you can think of a research question that is answerable with the data that we have, it's there to be answered, and that might include direct game-by-game comparisons. You are correct to note that that is not what we pitched to them as what we are primarily interested in. We're very careful not to rule things out that we mentioned. Exploratory analyses are possible. We will chase interesting directions when we find them. They have no say over our decision to publish, over what we analyze. All of that we retain control of. But there is a little bit of a shared value. I mean, I'm painting industry in a bad light, but the people who we work with directly are really committed to their player safety. They're sometimes dealing with their higher ups who are less committed to that, but they want us to look at the data in whatever way is going to be most informative, and we've left open that possibility. It's just that we all agree that it is not likely to be a game-by-game comparison that is the most informative way to identify that. I don't really think that there are particular titles that are super harmful. It is way more to do about the player and how they're approaching the game, patterns of play over time. So, if someone was playing an hour, and then suddenly 7 hours a day, 7 hours a day, 7 hours a day, those types of transitions might be much more informative than just trying to kind of single out or look at individual titles.
I agree. I guess it's about whether there are some platforms that have specific features, and you wouldn't necessarily, by comparing the platforms, say, okay, it's a platform difference, but you might be able to say, well, what's different about this platform? And then try to, I guess, beyond that, identify specific features that might be causing those differences. But yeah. But,
yeah, we could do. It's more challenging with games than in social media, because I think the features of the platform are pretty peripheral. Like they matter a little bit. They determine something about the types of games that are more likely to get published on Nintendo versus Xbox. But we have 10,000 games in our sample, and the games are much more relevant for determining kind of what the player is doing and how they might be feeling. So instead of comparing, 5 social media companies, we'd need to compare really 10,000 games based on some way of quantifying their features of which games are having this type of design system or level up system or social features or monetization features. And that is a really, really difficult task. But for a motivated person, maybe a really valuable one.
I'll let somebody else ask, but otherwise I've got another question.
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. So I'm also like a fellow game researcher, but more on like the qualitative side. So So my major question will be, since your survey asks a lot about, mental health and well-being, like this self-identified state of their mind. And my question will be like, to what extent do you trust them for their accuracy of self-assessment? Because when I do interviews with gamers, I constantly find a pattern of, at first they said they are fine, and then 2 minutes later they start to talk about all their like frustrated experience playing games, and that definitely create a complexity or like the nuance in qualitative data, but I imagine that will be an obstacle for quantitative research in psychology.
Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, of course.
Just want to ask that. How would you navigate the Hawthorne effect of the study? Like the game player is going to change their behavior because they know that they're being studied.
Sorry, one more time. I didn't quite get it.
Oh, Hawthorne effect.
Hawthorne.
Yeah. That the players know that they're
Yes.
being studied, so
Sure.
they change
Yeah,
their
yeah, yeah.
behaviors.
On both of those fronts, I don't think they are solvable problems for us in the context of a single study. When studying well-being, the only thing you can do is ask people and trust that they are giving you some signal, even in the noise. The fact that we have longitudinal assessments helps, because that means that even someone who has sort of their own calibrated baseline that sort of tends to always say, I'm at a 7, even if they're maybe secretly feeling a little more poorly than that. If they start feeling even worse than normal, we might still see them go down from a 7 to a 6.5 to a 6. So we can calibrate kind of individual baselines using the longitudinal data and still look at changes from that baseline. That's part of what this design is able to do. We do have a couple qualitative questions. We do ask them to talk about what problems, if any, they experience related to their gaming, what benefits, if any, they experience related to their gaming. So there's some analysis to do there. Those are in the biweekly survey, so there should be about 7,000 responses to people telling what types of effects they self-assess to be experiencing. But fundamentally, yeah, I think on both fronts, there is bias at every stage in terms of who we're able to recruit. People need to be willing to share fairly sensitive gaming-related data with us to participate. They know they're being observed. It's pretty unobtrusive in the sense of there is nothing when they're playing that tells them that they're being monitored. Like in a future study where we do alert, send a text when people start and end a session, that will create stronger demand effects. So people will be very aware that they're being monitored. In this case, it's happening very silently in the background over the course of 3 months, where I suspect after the first couple of days, it's no longer super at the front of their mind. But we would need to compare this data to a sample of people who never opted into the study in the first place to really quantify that. And maybe there's some market research companies that are doing that, but I think it would be its own fraught process to really get to the bottom of. Do you have a better answer?
No, I think it's a very interesting question of whether the scales, like how sensitive the scales are we're using, and there's a lot of interesting ongoing conversation about that. What I will say for somebody who has more faith in structured interviews is that there's not much stopping us or collaborators to contact the participants we have on Prolific and do a structured interview and maybe even compare what they found with what the scales are showing.
More questions? Okay, another one from me then. So you noted that you don't have data from minors, but you also noted that you have historical data. So would there be any way of doing a study looking, for example, using the historical data at how this has impacted people who recently turned 18?
Whoa. Truly never even crossed my mind.
Ah.
We have probably not a ton of participants in the 18 to 20 range, but so the participant range is 18 to 40, and we sampled initially from 18 to 30. And then when we had recruitment difficulties, we opened up to 30 to 40. So 75% of the participants are under 30. Some of those would be under 20, such that their play history would extend into their minor years. And yeah, what we could do with it, I'm not immediately sure, but like super cool thought.
I'll be involved, please.
We just want to thank Nick